All right. So the clock is ticking. We've got a big panel and literally a world to cover. So we're going to skip introductions. You can find out who everyone is by looking at your program. They need no introductions anyway. And hopefully my wonderful panel is under orders to keep their answers relatively short, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. And I want to begin actually by something that I know has been on the minds of all of us, maybe Ivo in particular, because you've been writing about it, actually so have I. This question about Pax Americana. Since 1947, at least, there has been a shared understanding on a bipartisan basis about the foundations of American foreign policy. We were not only in the business of looking out for ourselves, although of course we do, but we had wider responsibilities to what was called the free, or at least the free-ish world. We would come to the defense of embattled allies faced with aggressive or subversive dictatorships. That began with Greece and Turkey with the Truman Doctrine, and then extended all over the world. We would be known not only for our power, but also for our dependability, our decency, and our adherence to a set of core liberal values which typified our government at home and helped explain some of the values that we sought to pursue imperfectly around the world. Now, in the last, you might say, 8 years, but particularly in the last 3 weeks, all of that seems to be in question. So maybe I can begin with Ivo. Do you see that, is this the end of Pax Americana, or is this one of those periodic eruptions in American politics that will resolve itself in ways that have been familiar in American life in the last 80 years?
So first of all, thanks for inviting me, Jamie. Always good to be here and see so many people again. Yeah, it is the end. It's over in a very fundamental way. I date the Pax Americana from December 7, 1941, the moment when the United States finally entered World War II, to January 2025. It's dead. It's gone. It won't come back. Something else may come back, including a more altruistic foreign policy that the United States has pursued for those 80 years. But President Trump, both in his first term, but particularly in the last 3 weeks, has demonstrated that the values and core principles of the Pax Americana, which in some ways can, in policy terms, can reduce to a belief in security alliances, that your security depends on the security of other countries, particularly in Asia and Europe, a belief in a regulated but free and open market economic system through free trade that is regulated through institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the WTO, which followed after that, and a belief that our freedom depended on the freedom and democracy of other countries, and particularly those who were already democracies, that we would defend them. There was a debate in the US over the last 80 years whether you should actually export democracy or not, but at the very least, you needed to defend democracy, and you rightly said that starts with Greece and the Civil War in 1946 and 47. And these principles have, in one form or another, informed every president from FDR to Joe Biden, but not Donald Trump. He does not believe in alliances. Alliances are, in his view, as he said in 1987 when he published a full-page ad in the New York Times, alliances enable the United States to be played for a sucker. He called, the world was laughing at us in 1987, pretty interesting, laughing at us because we were not winning, and the only way you win is by others losing. And he's now implementing that in a very fundamental way, and I think it doesn't mean that we won't have another president at some point. We can't come back to some other form of government, but I think the Pax Americana is effectively dead, and we'll find another way to deal with that.
Eleni, before your turn in government here in California, you were America's ambassador in Hungary, actually at a particularly interesting moment in that country's history. Of course, Hungary emerged from the Warsaw Pact and the Cold War and became a liberal democracy. At the time, one of the leaders was this young liberal running the Fidesz party named Viktor Orban. Then he went out of power and then came back determined to change the internal, I mean, I'm talking almost in a classical sense, the internal nature of the regime, the way in which politics worked in Hungary, to what he called a liberal democracy. And you were a witness, really, with a front row seat to how that happened. Tell us a little bit about your what you saw as America's ambassador in Hungary then.
Well, first, let me also say what an honor it is to be here and with this incredibly distinguished panel. And right now, I'm just trying to absorb what Ivo said about the end of Pax Americana. We've had a good run. So I was in Hungary in 2010. Viktor Orban came to power just a few months later. And this whole idea of a playbook of steps that a leader can take with enough power and enough support from the electorate to basically just start sucking power out of the system into the hands of themselves and a few of their advisors and allies and family members. So it's remarkable that that was in 2010, and here we are seeing something very similar here in the United States. But we were talking earlier about the sort of Hungarian view of the world, and there are parallels there as well. Hungary has a very particular tragic history, much of it of their own making, but they have always felt tempest-tossed by the great powers. And so it's been very appealing popularly to have a Hungary first message to the people, and as a result, they've been standing alone, trying to hedge their bets, but largely being very supportive of Russia. So I think that idea that countries around the world and the United States are really shoring up their own ability to protect themselves. And we've talked yesterday, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about this change in how people feel, whether it's victimization or pessimism or FOMA or whatever. But there's no question that people are drawing in and thinking about their own safety. And I think that is what we're seeing in the United States as well. And so the impacts of that ultimately on American safety and security certainly concerns me as someone who believed in this notion, and still do, that American influence in the world and in keeping hot wars from erupting, keeping stability in the world, that ultimately that keeps us safe. Whether you're in Hungary or anywhere else thinking that you want to think of your own country first, the risk of that is that by not being involved in the world, we're actually making ourselves less safe.
I want to play a bit of a imaginary scenario. Max just wrote this brilliant biography of Ronald Reagan, which I hope you've all bought multiple copies of. And it's not an uncritical biography. It's just a wonderful biography. So Max, let's imagine that the Ronald Reagan of 1978 has a radio show, as he did here in California, and he is commenting on the foreign policy of the early weeks of the Trump administration. Tariffs, threats to Denmark to possibly seize Greenland, the belittling of the Canadian Prime Minister, Governor Trudeau, the Panama Canal, actually that cuts in various ways, questions about the durability of our alliances with our friends in Europe. What do you imagine ex-Governor Reagan saying about the foreign policy of the Trump administration in these first few weeks?
I imagine he would be very puzzled by it, because it was so much at odds with what he viewed as being his own foreign policy or Republican foreign policy at the time. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the Panama Canal, because that was an issue where he was very critical of the Carter administration for negotiating the Panama Canal Treaty. He split with some of his longtime allies on the right, like Bill Buckley and others, who were actually in favor of the Panama Canal Treaty. But
Bill was a secret Panamanian agent.
There you go. But the striking thing about the Panama Canal is that even though he was very critical of the treaty once it was negotiated, once he became president, he didn't do anything to undo it. He just accepted it and moved on and in fact, I think, history shows that all of the threats that he and other opponents of the treaty were conjuring up have not come to pass. In fact, Panama has been a very responsible steward of the canal, and it hasn't been taken over by communists or anti-Americans or anybody else. In fact, Panama today has a very pro-American conservative government. So I think Reagan was, as I was talking about yesterday, I think one of Reagan's key attributes was that although he could be very ideological, he could also be very pragmatic, and he was able to deal with facts as they were, not as he would always want them to be, and to kind of move on. And I think that, he was certainly able to do that in the case of the Panama Canal. And I think, to the rest of your question, Reagan was a very passionate supporter of NATO. He was a very, if you actually go back and read his wonderful address in Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day on June 6, 1984, it wasn't just, people remember the tribute to the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc, the Rangers who stormed the cliff, but so much of the address was actually about transatlantic unity and vowing that we would never abandon Europe. And you remember Reagan was part of the greatest generation. He saw the consequences of American isolationism in the 1930s when he was a staunch FDR liberal and opposed isolationism, and he saw the consequences we paid. And I think, there's kind of what we're seeing now in the Republican Party and in the White House is kind of this historical amnesia where, Trump is resurrecting the slogan of America First, which, as we know, is the discredited slogan of Charles Lindbergh and other isolationists of the 1930s. And now he's trumpeting that as his policy. And that's diametrically opposed to what Ronald Reagan believed, and certainly diametrically opposed to what the Republican Party has stood for in the post-World War II era.
Dave, I want to ask you, because you have spent important parts of your career being the kind of very, very hard tip of the spear of American hard power. But American power comes in two varieties: hard power, the power to impose, and soft power, the ability to attract. And it's always been the balance of those two forces that has, I think, given America its sort of unique role as a benign hegemon, as a superpower. When you were commanding American forces, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq or CENTCOM commander, how important to you was the reputation of America as a guarantor of a fundamentally liberal world order that favored the free, that brought succor to the needy, that brought assistance to desperate places? Just how important is that in the equation when you are also trying to impose consequences on bad guys?
Well, it's hugely important, and you fight very hard, actually, to be seen in the light that we would like to be seen, that we care about the people. And this is why it was so damaging to have, for example, Abu Ghraib. Yeah. That's indelible. It's non-biodegradable. It's always out there. So you're constantly trying to avoid that kind of action and constantly trying to show that we care about the people, that we're trying to provide them not just security, but a better life. And in fact, I was somewhat famous for saying at one point early on, when I was a two-star after the fight to Baghdad and jump up to Mosul, I said, money is ammunition. We actually have security. The way you solidify the security foundation is by building on it and showing the people that, again, we're providing a better life for them in a whole host of different ways, including in our, if you will, political and social and other mores. I mean, there were some humorous events over the years, but one of those right early on when we're up in Mosul, people would flock up to me and they'd say, we love America, we love George Bush, we love democracy, what is it? And so it was incumbent on us to try to show them what democracy was in their society, their culture, and we then respected, again, their own religious and ethnic and tribal and other norms and so forth. And it is very, very important. You're trying to win hearts and minds. And you don't do it just by getting rid of all the bad guys and then keeping them secure. But it starts with that, by the way. If you don't have a security foundation, all the rest of it doesn't matter. But when you have a security foundation, the way you solidify it is by building on it and, again, providing a better life for the people. And that really is critical.
Let me put on a Trumpian hat for a second, Ivo, and say...
Doesn't fit well, by the way.
No, but I'll do my best here. My little MAGA hat. So this this Trumpian voice says this. Yeah, alliances are great in principle, but the fact is that unmistakably we have been taken advantage of. If it weren't for America spending 9 times more on defense than the next several nations combined, Europe would be a satrap of Russia. The Europeans, even now, continue to play a game in which they seek to sell. Germans want to sell cars in China. They want to import, at least until 2 years ago, cheap oil from Russia and make themselves dependent. They have not been good allies. A swift kick in the rear and real threats to their security and an end to this, as they see it, endless free ride that the United States has provided them is long overdue. After a while, nations have to take care of their own security, their foreign policy, and we can't simply underwrite that forever. And I think there's some justice to that critique. You were ambassador in NATO, you grew up in Holland. Like, how do you get the Europeans to move? And do you think that Trump just might be able to achieve more through his bullying than previous presidents achieved through kind of polite diplomatic pleading?
So I think the critique has value. It's, by the way, a critique that every president since 1952, when Truman called for the deployment of 90 divisions as part of European divisions in NATO. We were a little short of that. Every president has wanted Europe to do more for 2 reasons. Fundamentally, in order for the United States not to have to do as much. Let me forget that NATO was more what one scholar once called an empire by invitation. It was the Europeans who asked the United States to come in. It wasn't the United States that had all of a sudden decided we really wanted to be in Europe. That emerged in the late 40s and then into the 1950s. There was no NATO, actually, when the treaty was signed. There was no organization. There was no military command structure. All of that came only after the Korean War. So wanting the Europeans to do more is something that I think all American officials and presidents have sought to do. And I would argue that the progress that Europe has made in doing more, particularly since 2014, and especially since 2022, has to do with the reality that they now face a threat that they didn't see before. And the bullying didn't produce more spending. A Russian military invasion of a neighboring country produced more military spending at a very significant rate. $450 billion more being spent in the last 4 years by Europeans on defense. Not an insignificant amount of money. But the second, and that's where I think the change comes in, the second reason is a fundamental understanding that Roosevelt started, and every president has maintained, that the security of Europe is fundamental to our security. We're not in Europe or in Asia because we're doing favors to other countries. No, we're in Europe and Asia to prevent war, because if war comes, we will have to fight it at much greater cost, and Dave can tell you what that cost would be, than having peace. And that part of the equation, in a win-lose mindset, just isn't part of the Trumpian worldview. And as a result, one of the reasons Europeans are now really starting to do more is not only because they fear what Russia can do to them, but they fear what the United States can do to them, including leaving. I mean, we have a president of the United States who has threatened the use of military force against an ally, Greenland. Greenland is a part of NATO. In fact, we already have an obligation as a treaty member to defend Greenland. You don't need to own it to defend it.
We're also the single largest military power in Greenland.
But by far, so we can take it over tomorrow. That's true too. But that's not, you don't create security that way. What you create is insecurity. And that's what the Russians are really good at. It's not something that the United States has traditionally done or should be doing.
Eleni, one of the tools that Trump, of course, has very now notoriously deployed is tariffs, the most beautiful word in the English language, apparently. I didn't know that, but so now I want you to talk to us in your role as lieutenant governor, because few economies, I mean, all state economies are exposed. I think none quite as exposed to two of Trump's signature moves, the tariff threats to our neighbors and, of course, to China as well, and the issue of immigration. So talk us through just how those decisions in Washington affect you in Sacramento.
Sure. Again, I'm just thinking about what Ivo is saying is so fascinating, but pivoting a little bit to tariffs and immigration, there is no question that what the policies that come out of Washington in those two areas in particular have an outsized effect, a disproportionate effect on California because of the size of our economy and because of our population. So we're 40 million people and we have an economy the size of India. When tariffs are put on goods from Canada and Mexico, which right now he backed away from those, absolutely has an impact on inflation here because, as we know, very often in the manufacturing process, things go back and forth over the border several times. So it would just drive up the costs of manufactured goods, whether the finished product comes out of California or elsewhere. And then on immigration, this is already, we are feeling the impacts of it because of the chill to these communities. It's hard to quantify exactly the percentage of undocumented people here in our beautiful state of California. And if, by the way, you're traveling from elsewhere to be here, welcome. But it is
surprisingly nice.
At least considering the country sees us as some kind of a wasteland, you know. California is a place of extremes, by the way, and I would say this is one of the more beautiful places, but there are many. So this economy is very largely run on a workforce that has a high percentage of undocumented people who work very, very hard and do the kinds of jobs that many first generation, second generation, and on people don't want to do. So at least 50% of our farm jobs are held by undocumented Californians, and it's at least 10% of the jobs overall in our state. Again,
I want to push you on this.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying that's an asset, not a liability.
Oh, yeah, no question. No question. California has disproportionately benefited from generous immigration policies of the United States over the last 50 years. It is why we are such a powerful economic engine here.
But I'm just gonna push you here. Look,
It's just true.
But let me push you on this because I think it's a really important subject. A lot of other Americans, including the majority of Americans who just elected Donald Trump, would say, hang on a second, you are calling an asset something that is founded on the violation of federal law. Many of these jobs might not exist if it weren't for undocumented workers, but surely some percentage of these jobs are being taken from American citizens at the lower end of the economic ladder. It causes strains on social services. I mean, I know in New York City we have tens of thousands of people living in tent cities and old abandoned airports out in Queens. Shouldn't the government of California look with more askance at the massive law breaking that this huge migration represents? And aren't you worried as a Democrat that it is stoking precisely the kind of populist reaction based on the things I just mentioned that lead to politics many of us don't like?
So I'll say this both as the Lieutenant Governor of California and as a former United States ambassador, and by the way, as the daughter of a refugee to the United States. So, so immigration is obviously very complicated. We have needed immigration reform for a very long time, and those efforts, bipartisan efforts, have been scuttled now at least two very close times that we know of, one very recently in the Biden administration, scuttled because domestic politics in so many ways relies on people fighting about this. So we have to have sensible immigration policies, and we have to have reform on some level. I believe that for a very long time. The United States, most recently, with the distortion and the abuse of the asylum system, that has caused a lot of problems. All those things you're talking about, but not to mention the fact that trafficking in persons has exploded because of people being taken advantage of by cartels and by organizations that are taking every last penny in order to give them a chance to come to the United States. It has been terrible, and we, as a country, Democrats and Republicans, we have let everybody down. We've let Americans down, and we've let migrants down. So again, we are where we are. I think two things can be true. Immigration has built this country and built the California economy, but having a system of rule of law that defines how people can come into this country to immigrate or to visit or to work, we absolutely have to have that. And I'm hopeful, because I just don't want to be unhopeful about everything for the next 4 years, that, we'll get there.
Max, you are, among other things, a historian of military conflict. Twain's great line, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme," comes to mind these days. In the 1930s, you had a tripartite, 1940 tripartite agreement between the three leading autocratic powers or three of the four leading autocratic powers of the time, Germany, Japan, and Italy, actually joined in a sense by the Soviet Union at one point. Today, you have the pact of, I think, limitless friendship between Russia and China, North Korean troops fighting Russia's war in Ukraine. Amazingly, these North Koreans don't even know who they're fighting. You can just imagine the tragedy for these troops. Iran supplying Russia with drones it is using to attack Kyiv. So when you think you think about this historically, we are faced with, it seems like, a very similar situation to the late 30s, early 40s. One important difference, of course, is that in the late 30s and early 40s, we had FDR as president. Now we have Trump. Can the free world be defended now, or I mean, just give us a sense of your pessimism.
I'm tempted to say that we have Charles Lindbergh as president now, but I mean, I think the threats that you're pointing out are very real, and I think we need to keep in mind that even with a defense budget of $850 billion, which is a lot of money, there is no way that the United States can stand alone against a gathering storm that includes, as you pointed out, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Those are a lot of adversaries to deal with, especially at once, especially when you consider the fact that China, unlike the Soviet Union, is a near peer competitor to the United States in the economic arena, which the Soviet Union certainly was not. So I think, you know, and I'm sure General Petraeus and others can confirm this, the critical force multiplier here is our allies. We have to stand with our allies, because alone we're going to be defeated, but together with our allies, we are far stronger. And this is a key advantage that we have, because yes, it's true that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working together, but we, you know, one of the achievements of President Biden, for which he doesn't get enough credit, is he marshaled more than 50 countries to come together to support Ukraine in their battle for freedom against the Russian invasion. He also did a lot to advance the Quad, with working with Australia, India, and Japan to try to contain Chinese power, and made great progress in the trilateral relationship between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, as well as the AUKUS agreement with Australia. So these are all amazing force multipliers for the United States, and this is our secret strength. This is how, you know, standing together with other largely free countries, a few not so free, but standing together with our allies around the world, I think we have more than enough power to contain the threats that we are facing. But if we are pursuing an America First policy, we're basically frittering away our number one advantage. If we're starting trade wars with our allies instead of bringing ourselves closer with our allies, that is doing the bidding of China, Iran, North Korea, all of Russia, all of our adversaries. We have to stand together, or we will all fall separately.
Dave, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I did, because I had the privilege of commanding two very large coalitions, and the one in Afghanistan, I think, is the largest ever fighting coalition in history. And I always thought that Churchill's comment really captured the reality very well. And of course, that's the one that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And it was very true, and I felt that very keenly. There were lots of problems with allies.
And I think he said that the heaviest cross he had to bear was the cross of Lorraine, a reference to Charles de Gaulle.
And, among others. Yeah. And in fact, Eisenhower's genius, of course, what really made him stand out was actually dealing with these egos, Churchill's included, Montgomery and de Gaulle, and he even had those that we don't think of, Bradley and Patton and others. They all had egos as well. And so what you did as a coalition commander is you actually had to assess every contingent, understand what they could do and what they couldn't do. Every single one of them, other than the U.S., had caveats that you can't do this or you can't do that. Then we had to assess what are their shortcomings, and we would have to compensate for it with U.S. Soldiers, intelligence, drones, air medevac, you name it. There was one contingent, in fact, they had quite a significant limitation. They were not allowed to conduct offensive operations. So we were scratching our head with how are we going to use these guys? And I said, why don't we give them a company of 82nd Airborne Division paratroopers who are offensive by their nature. They can go out and do the offensive operation. They get in trouble deliberately, and this contingent can come to their rescue and contribute very helpfully. And
Where was this contingent from?
It should remain unsaid.
Okay.
It's a new NATO member, though.
Okay.
But in any event, but now I actually do agree with.
It was the Lincolnberry contingent.
That again, our allies haven't done enough, and I'm actually not convinced that Trump's beating up on them doesn't actually end up with them doing more. Yes, it's all about the Russian threat, it's about this or that. I actually think that I travel constantly, including to Ukraine and countries around it and so forth. I actually think some of the browbeating actually does generate results, as with the threats with tariffs or this or that. Panama is going to back away from being part of the Belt and Road Initiative in the future in China. So I'm a little bit more torn on some of these. The style about it, the way it's done, some of this could be perhaps adjusted here and there, but some of this actually works.
Let's talk a little bit about our enemies. One of the differences between democracies and dictatorships is that democracies advertise their weaknesses and hide their strengths. I mean, all we do in the press, there's never been a New York Times headline that says, the world marginally better today than yesterday, although chances are that that's true every single day. Dictatorships...
Especially since you went to the New York Times.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's worse since then. Dictatorships do the opposite. They advertise their strengths and hide their weaknesses. But one of the things we discovered when Russia sent its units into Ukraine 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, excuse me, it was an incompetent kind of Potemkin village of a military. It's hard to gauge, Ivo, like just how weak, how vulnerable, how potentially close to defeat Russia is now, because all we see is Vladimir Putin's sort of Cheshire cat grin. He always seems to look like he's in command, but clearly their system is under strain. Do you think that at some point we're going to start to see a Russian crack-up due to the amount of pressure that they've been subjected to?
I don't know if you're going to see a crack-up. I mean, first, let me put your question in a broader context. I think Donald Trump inherited a world in which the relative power of the United States vis-a-vis its enemies is larger than probably any time since George W. Bush became president prior to 9/11. Because you have incredible weakness in Iran, mainly because of the way Israel has dealt with its axis of resistance. You have a weak economic basis in China that we can talk about, but the Chinese economy is in deep trouble, and its demography is making that long-term even worse. And you have Russia. Russia lost its entire army in a year. Every single piece of equipment that they had at the start of the war was gone. They are now fighting largely with Soviet-era equipment. So when they bring tanks to the fore, or fighting vehicles, fighting vehicles, or what have you, they are refurbished Soviet-era stuff that is not as good as the stuff they were making in the last 20 years. Number two, the Russians have now lost over 800,000 men. Not killed, but lost. Casualties. The estimate is that probably a third of those are killed. They're not coming back. And a large number of the remainder are wounded and won't be able to fight. These are extraordinary numbers. Remember that the Soviet Union left Afghanistan because 15,000 Russian soldiers were killed in the period of 10 years. So you add up the manpower problem, which also exists not only in your army, but in your domestic economy, because you need to produce and refurbish these tanks and produce shells and bullets and everything else, with the reality that Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that this is a major war, is not willing to mobilize his capabilities. They are paying for manpower, both to fight on the front and to serve in the defense industry, wages that are competitive in the United States. You can make $80,000 to go stand on the front line. That's an extraordinary amount of money if you're living in Siberia. And indeed, that is how they are sustaining this fight. But economically, this is unsustainable. So sometime in late 2025, probably 2026, they're going to have incredible inflation. They're going to run out of the ability to produce equipment at the rate that they need to, and they're going to run out of manpower. Except if we do something really stupid, which is to lift sanctions in order to try to get a deal with Vladimir Putin, and stop providing the aid that has allowed Ukraine to destroy a major part of the Russian military capability. If we stop both of those, then the Russians will be rescued, not by the Russian people, but by us.
Dave, put on your KKR hat for a moment. Back in the 1980s, many things helped bring down the Soviet Union. Ivo mentioned its losses in Afghanistan. Another thing that helped bring it down was the plummeting price of oil due to higher interest rates in the United States and more production. Trump actually has broached this thought that much greater production here in the United States opening up Anwar, other areas that we haven't explored, could have seismic geopolitical effects. How do you see energy as part of kind of the global security equation?
Well, first of all, it's what has sustained Russia, without question. Even though the natural gas isn't going to Europe anymore, even though the other energy products and so forth aren't flowing, this is what has fueled this economy, which is already struggling. Inflation is already high. Interest rates are very, very high as well. So no question, again, that if you produce more oil, pump more natural gas, the real question here actually is that, or the reality, and I used to run into this with the Saudis, for example, when I was commander of U.S. Central Command over all the Middle East, and they'd say, why don't you guys stop producing so much oil, or in some other cases, produce more oil if we're going to put sanctions on Iran, as we did during that time. And the reality is that we don't have Aramco. This is not a state-owned oil enterprise, and it depends on free market. And if the price of oil is going up, you're going to see the rig count go up, the drilling will go up. If it doesn't, and so the question really is, how much more can we actually put on the market? And then also, how much does OPEC and how much do they control this, and so forth. But clearly, energy security is a huge issue around the world. I'd like to see us actually do more in all ways of energy, including, by the way, obviously not just renewables, but to a degree in crude and natural gas, do it more cleanly if we can, because the demand that is about to hit the United States is tied up with data centers. You know, it's not quite 3% of our energy right now is fueling data centers. It could go up to 8 to 10% in the future, and data centers are the cutting edge. Obviously, that's what enables artificial intelligence and a lot of the other advances that are fueling the productivity in the United States. We're in a real boom in that regard. So again, I'd like to see actually more sanctions on Russia, and I think we actually will see more of that, and try to cut off the ghost fleet that they have, and however it is they're still able to get this to countries that are willing to buy it, including India, which is a paradox for us, a member of the Quad and so forth. I'd love to see that additional pressure, because I think, like Ivo does, that Russia is much more on the ropes in various respects than they seem to be. I guess the other question is also, how solid is Putin? And this is one of those paradoxical situations where you say that it's inconceivable that he could be toppled until the day after he is toppled, and you're going to say it was inevitable. Yeah. I mean, regime change in Syria is a massive development, because it means that Iran can't re-equip Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, because they can no longer use bases in Syria, air bases, et cetera, factories and so on, or bring it from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and down into Bekaa.
All right, we have just over a minute left, so we're going to have a lightning round. Question is, and no, it's just a lightning question. Optimist or pessimist about the United States, and a sentence or two as to why. Max?
Oh, gosh. I guess I'm a pessimistic optimist or an optimistic pessimist. I think
it's a cop-out. Come on.
Well, I think the reality is I think we have tremendous strengths in the fact that the U.S. is still about 25% of global GDP, as we were 50 years ago. We still have the most powerful military. We still have the greatest alliance system in the world. So there's a tremendous dynamism and strength in this country, and I'm just concerned that we're going to fritter it away with chaos in Washington and the turning away from our allies and trade partners. But I think fundamentally, the fundamentals are still solid. It's just that our political system is haywire.
Ivo?
So I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States because of the strength and the more incredible nature of this country when I was 24. And so I am an optimist by nature. But I also come from a continent where it's hard to be optimistic. My mother is a Holocaust survivor. I know what it looks like when things go haywire. And everything I see in the last 3 weeks makes me deeply, deeply, deeply pessimistic about the nature of this country.
Eleni?
I'm programmed toward optimism. I live in California. I'm deeply concerned as well as to where we are right now in the United States, in our national conversation, in the bullying posture of our leadership, and so much that doesn't make sense. But this is the greatest country in the history of the world, and we've been here before, we've had chaos before. If we all do our part, I believe that we will be able to come through this. And one thing, General, since you mentioned energy, California, regardless, is going to continue to invest in the clean energy transition. This could just be an enormous strength for the country over time. There is always a tomorrow, and always more innovation, and always, I think, things that we can do to keep peace and prosperity here at home, and as much as we can do that in the world.
Dave, the last word.
So I'm a rational optimist. I think that, first of all, that human nature, humans have overcome incredible obstacles time and time again. Often, of course, and also another Winston Churchill aphorism, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried all the other things. But I actually think there's something unique to our system here and the incentives. And of course, California represents that. I mean, why is it that people come here to found a company? You only have to look at Silicon Valley, or now Silicon Beach and LA and so forth, and you see that system is very much alive and well, despite concerns about resilience of institutions and so forth. Beyond that, the president keeps a very close eye on markets, and I think that will continually bring us back when we're contemplating this or that might upset that system and the trends that we have in the country. The most important one of which is productivity, and that is huge. Obviously, GDP is a factor of product of size of your workforce times its productivity. Of course, that's your comments about immigration. And again, I think that it's going to be okay, although I have obviously some concerns as well.
Thank you very much.